publishing very soon, where we've encouraged our youth empowerment committee has encouraged local artists to envision voting and voter information and empowerment as a piece of art. And so we have several submissions we're going to use to promote that as well. And this is one of the items I like to call attention to as well. It's 100 Days of Action. You can click straight to that from our website, and you can sign up right here for any opportunities. But this is a daily opportunity or an action where we'll send it to your inbox. You can follow us on our social media. But we tell you every day one thing that you can do to be an informed voter and to support the current elections and support our democracy. So with that, I just want to go ahead and turn it back over. I want to invite everybody to visit us, lwvsandiego.org. Spend some time on our site, look at our voting resources. Here we have a lot of opportunities to click through to other resources, including the Registrar of Voters. You probably saw that, Michael. SD Vote was on there as well. This is our online voter guide, votersedge.org, and it customizes to your particular ballot. As Michael will probably tell you, you'll get a ballot that's customized to your address, and this voter guide does that for you as well, and it'll pull up your voting information and allow you to create your own virtual online ballot that you can use when your official ballot arrives to complete your official ballot. So with that, I'll just turn it back over. Thank you so much for Evan for giving me the opportunity, and I invite people to spend some time on our site.
Thank you very much, Lori. We're going to go next to Michael Vu for his kind of opening thoughts on our topic today. Michael.
Well, thanks so much, Evan. I appreciate the actual whiteboard that is right behind you, because that's exactly where we're at today, which is at E-27 and counting. But really, for all of you that are in the audience here, it's certainly a great opportunity for me to express that this election has already started. We have already sent out 1.9 million registered voters a mail ballot in our county, and that number keeps on growing. Evan, when you provided my bio, it was at nearly 1.8 million, and now we're at 1.9 million registered voters. We have added over a quarter million new registrants since the 2016 presidential general elections. We're sending out over 2 million local sample ballot and voter information pamphlets to registered voters across all of our registered voters in our county. And when we think about this upcoming elections, there are 196 contests that are on the ballot across the entire county. When you overlay all of those different contests on top of one another that represents all the variations of the ballot, we get 842 different types of the ballot. All voters in our county you all get one ballot type, knowing that there are 841 other variations of that ballot. But in our county, we also support 5 federally covered languages in total. And when you multiply that across the 842 ballot types, you get 4,210 variations of the ballot. So when Lori was talking about the sample and ballot and voter information pamphlet, know that there are 4,210 variations of that ballot that is circulating within our county as we speak and are being delivered to voters. But one of the important pieces that I want to talk about is really the pandemic itself and the changes that it has caused and how it's upended all of our world and our quality of life. And this is now one aspect of that is our response to ensuring everyone is able to cast a ballot, not just to ensure the integrity of the overall election, the accuracy of the election, the security of the election, the transparency of the overall election, but now balancing that with the overall health and safety of our voters and providing an environment for individuals to cast their ballot. Certainly one of the aspects in our county is our Vote Safer San Diego campaign that we've launched into. It's the most comprehensive and robust campaign that we've launched into ever in this county to inform voters of 2 significant factors in this upcoming election. One is that every single voter in our county will receive a mail ballot in this upcoming election. And 2 is the changes that in-person polling locations that will be out there in response to the election. That is, we're not going from moving away from a traditional neighborhood polling place environment to a more consolidated super polling location environment for voters to cast a vote should they want to in this upcoming election. But our main campaign right here now is for voters to vote their mail ballot and return it back through the U.S. Postal Service. And I know that we'll probably get into that aspects of it. Any of our drop-off locations or at any one of our 235 super polling locations that we will have. There's a lot to be discussing. It is a presidential election, and there are a number of confluences of events that's happening in this upcoming election other than the presidential race. I think that's just one aspect of this whole election that we have. You've got the pandemic itself, racial justice movements that are occurring, a Supreme Court justice that has passed away, an economy that's out there, cyber security concerns since the last presidential general election. You got wildfires out there, and then you've got a host of disinformation that we want to make sure that we're dispelling at every turn. So there's a lot of things on the ballot other than those 196 contests, and now it's the time for voters to make their voices known. So with that being said, I'll turn the time back over to Evan.
Great, thanks, Michael. Look forward to asking you a lot more questions about administrating this election in this unprecedented time. But we want to also have Dr. Kousser offer your first thoughts too, looking at the election not only in California, but maybe a more national bird's eye view of what we should be expecting to see this year.
All right, thanks so much, Professor Crawford. So 2020's election was going to be complicated, even if it weren't for the pandemic. But the pandemic, as is complicated much of American life, has made how this election is run, how people vote, and how people will perceive the outcome even more complicated. So that's why it's so important that we have strong registrars like Michael Vu and others up and down the state, as well as groups like the League of Women Voters, helping you dispel fact from fiction. I want to focus in particular on setting the record straight, or providing the best evidence from a range of studies that looks at this question of how you cast your ballot, how people want to cast their ballot in an era of pandemic, whether there are potential problems with the integrity of this process, whether it's done by mail or in the polling place, and what the potential partisan effects of this are. So this is something that political scientists have studied in California and in other states for a long time, voting by mail. One thing that we know from study after study is that incidents of fraud in voting by mail are vanishingly small. 0.000, I believe, like 5 or 6 zeros, 36% of ballots cast have been fraudulent over the last few decades. So it's incredibly small, in part because there's so many safeguards that elections officials, Republican, Democratic, and nonpartisan, all across the country put into effect. So that includes, right, when you sign them, they check your signature against your voter registration. Many of them have individual codes on the mailing that in California now allow you to track your ballot through the Where's My Ballot app that the Secretary of State has put out in conjunction with local registrars, and also ensure that these are coming, that one and only one ballot is counted per voter. So there are lots of safeguards in place. And because of that, we just haven't seen the fraud, very many instances of fraud. So one case from North Carolina, and one emerging case from New Jersey. But out of the millions and hundreds of millions of votes cast in decades, this has not been a source of problems. It hasn't also in the past been a source of any partisan divide. So Republicans and Democratic voters have wanted to take advantage of this opportunity to vote, and especially at the beginning of this year, both members of both parties became more and more interested in voting by mail. There have been studies, so a recent one that came out of Stanford and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences showed that if you looked at the expansions of voting by mail in California, Colorado, in Utah, in Washington, in any of those states, when registrars had rolled out voting by mail, it had not led to any change in the partisan composition of turnout or the way that people voted. It hadn't advantaged either of the parties. So there's a pretty strong supposition that a pretty strong record of evidence that Democrats as well as Republicans were using this. knowing this, but also knowing the increasing level of controversy, especially as the president started making unevidenced claims about voter fraud and voting by mail, a group of us at the University of California conducted a series of surveys, both in California and a series of, we're about to roll out our fourth survey nationally, all of them large surveys with random samples of more than 5,000 voters to look at who wants to cast their vote, how they trust the process, and what sorts of policies they support going forward. What we found was this. In California, where both parties have experience voting by mail, there, at least at the beginning of the election, at the pandemic, no partisan divide over voting by mail. But nationally, there was a partisan divide of about 10 points that opened up in April, between where Democrats and independent voters more likely to want to vote by mail. As we saw a ramping up of partisan rhetoric and a divide between leaders, what we saw was a large shift, and this partisan gap became a gulf. So it grew to 20 points in a June survey and 25 points in our August survey. So what we found nationally in August is that about just over 50% of Democrats nationally want to cast a ballot by mail, only about 25% of Republicans. In itself, that's fine, right? We have election systems that give voters both options, right? They can vote in a polling place, and in California, it's now in these super polls. In many states, it's still traditional neighborhood polling places, and they can vote by mail in nearly every state, and all of the, just about all of the swing states in our national election allow this by request absentee voting, where people who want to send in a request and receive that ballot. And that's something that the president has strongly endorsed, this by request absentee voting. So in some ways, we are now at a time when there's a divide in between how the parties want to cast their votes, but a set of laws that allow people to cast their vote in any way they're comfortable with, and that they don't feel puts them at risk. How should that change what we look for on election night? Well, I think what it should do is make us do what we always do, which is wait for all the ballots to be counted before we declare winners, and be aware that the ballots that are cast at polling places, both in California, but also nationally, may yield a different set of results than votes cast by mail, for a perfectly legitimate set of reasons. Not because there's fraud, but just because voters in the two parties have different levels of comfort with these two different ways of voting. So a recent Union Tribune ABC poll that just came out last week showed that people who vote at polling places in California, among them, Donald Trump will win in a landslide victory. But among a much larger group of Californians who expect to vote by mail, Joe Biden has a strong lead right now. So that means that what we're going to see in some of the initial returns, which are a mixture of early arriving absentee ballots and ballots cast at polling places in California, and in many other states, they're really going to be focused on election day voters. Those may look different than the returns that we'll see when all the votes are counted. In particular, they're going to be more Republican leaning. And that's consistent with the last several elections. So in research by Ohio State Law School professor Ned Foley, which is called, he has a paper called The Big Blue Shift. What he's shown is that in election after election in recent years, the first ballots that are shown, the first ones counted, the first returns that we see on those network news events on election night, those are much more Republican leaning than the final returns are when all those vote by mail ballot and other provisional ballots in some states are counted. We should expect that gap to be even wider, that big blue shift to be even bigger in this election. And again, that won't indicate anything nefarious going on. It will just be because voters want to cast ballots in different ways. What does this mean? It means we all got to be patient on election night. We're likely to not have any idea who the next president is going to be when we go to bed on election night. And we're going to need to give registrars across the state, and they follow across the country, they follow different deadlines, the time they need to legitimately count all of those legitimate ballots. In San Diego, it means some of these races that are going to be nail-bitingly close We're not going to know on election night who's won probably the mayor's race. We're not going to know maybe who's won the 50th congressional district, the District 3 of the county supervisor's race. That should be really close. We probably won't know the outcome of that. Key propositions like Prop 15, we just likely won't know, and that's been the case in a lot of elections in the past, where we've seen results flip once all the ballots are cast. I think what we need to do is just take the time, have the trust that our elections officials have urged, and wait until all the ballots are counted before we decide how this contentious and complex and highly consequential election of 2020, and until we can decide what is fact and what is fiction, we're going to have all the ballots counted. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Kousser. So it struck me as you were giving us kind of this expectation setting for the national picture, that we can say we should just be patient, and that it, for many, will be easier said than done, probably for at the presidential level, and so maybe if we wait for the 50th a local congressional race, or we have guests here who are from all over the place in their local congressional races, maybe more willing or used to, or waiting for local races a few days to get these full results. And it's a different conversation when we're talking about a presidential election, especially surrounding all the rhetoric that's been the case. So I was actually wondering then if Michael, I could follow up with you on giving us kind of like the sequence in San Diego County of like what ballots are counted when, and then to the extent that your office works with local media about how they should be reporting these. We're kind of used to several decades now when we watch on TV percent precincts reporting, and increasingly what we've been kind of told is that really isn't the model to be paying attention to now. So what does your office do as far as the sequence of which ballots are counted when, and then how should we be thinking about local media, how they're supposed to be reporting it? And just even for those who aren't in San Diego, to kind of get a perspective of wherever you are, there is someone, a registrar of voters, who is also thinking through these steps, and there is a sequence of counting.
Well, Evan, let me just say, I think there's something significant here is that whatever I say based off of what San Diego County is doing is certainly going to be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, from state to state, because every state has their respective set of laws. And so the process that we have here and how we report out election results certainly is going to be dramatically different, let's say back east in certain states where certain ballots have to be counted in a specific time frame and only at a specific time frame. So let me give you San Diego, let me give you what the state of California has provided in terms of its policy. Certainly part of that is now changed because of the pandemic. There has been new legislation specifically for this upcoming election. So we have, as I mentioned before, every voter in the state of California, every active registered voter in the state of California is going to be receiving a mail ballot in their mailbox for this upcoming election, also known as absentee voting. I think there is a striking difference between the two that individuals out there are trying to make between absentee voting versus mail ballot voting. And what I've heard out there is that absentee voting is the act of requesting a ballot because you're going to be absent versus automatically receiving a mail ballot. Here in the state of California, those are two terms are synonymous with one another, because you do not have to, in certain cases, request a mail ballot. And when you do so, you can sign up to be a permanent mail ballot voter. That is, anytime that there is an election that pertains to you, we will send you a mail ballot. That's not necessarily the case in many states throughout the entire country. Every election, in particular cases in other states, you have to request a mail ballot or an absentee ballot before you can receive one. And you have to list, in certain cases, a reason why you are going to be absent from the polling location. And if you don't have one of those, let's say 12 to 15 reasons why, then you cannot vote an absentee ballot or a mail ballot. Here in our county, it's no excuse absentee or no excuse mail ballot voting in our state. So what has the legislature provided? When we issued the mail ballot to every single registered voters, we have already started receiving ballots back. We just started sending them out on Monday, and we already have in-house over 13,000 voted mail ballots in our possession. 10,000 of them came back through the U.S. Postal Service today. We now have the ability to not just signature verify the signature off of the envelope against that of the registration form, but we now have the ability to, after it's been verified, extract the ballot out and scan it into our tabulation system. And the only thing that we cannot do is report out those election results until the polls close at 8 p.m. Normally, in a traditional normal polling place environment, a precinct environment, neighborhood precinct environment, where we would anticipate around 1,600 precincts with over 9,000 poll workers, that first set of election results that would be reported out would be the mail ballots. Would be all the mail ballots that came into our office that we had the ability and time to signature verify, extract the ballots, make sure that the voter intent is clear. You'd be surprised of how unclear some of these ballots are marked, and we're having to make sure that the voter's intent is very clear. Of course, everyone knows about the 2000 presidential election and the notorious hanging Chad. Well, that was about intent. We still have to address that. Every election official has to still address voter intent when it comes down to filling in the bubble or circling around the bubble or putting a dot in the bubble. But for us, if we have the respective time to process that ballot into the count, and normally it's in the 2018 general election, it represented 33% of the total votes that were cast in the 2018 gubernatorial general elections. That is the very first report, is the mail ballots. But because of the pandemic, because we are shifting our model now to what we're calling a super polls locations, which is the ability to go to one of the 235 super polling locations, which are much larger in space, as opposed to having a neighborhood garage or a pizza parlor serving as a polling location, which has maybe 100 or 200, maybe 300 square feet in space. All of our super polling locations are on the average 2,000 square feet in space to be able to facilitate social distancing as well as keeping everyone safe, as well as managing to the surge of the turnout that we're expecting. But these super polling locations is not just going to be open for one day, and that's what traditionally happens. They're going to be open for a 4-day period. So our operation is now shifting towards a 4-day affair across 235 super polling locations. And because these locations are going to be open for a 4-day window, we're now able to actually report out polling place results on that first set of results. Okay. So after, what will happen on election night is shortly after the polls close here in California is 8 o'clock, and the polls close perhaps differently in other states. For us, the first set of results is now going to include not just mail ballots, but it'll include polling place results from those 3 days prior. And then what will happen is the mail ballots will stay static for the rest of the night. And what we will then receive are all the votes cast at the polling locations on election day from across those 235. So what ends up happening is you see a lull. And depending on how large this turnout is going to be, and this is not so much as us, but we're only going to be as good as how many people are going to turn out at their respective polling locations. And if there is a surge of polling locations, the last person in line, regardless of how long that line is, whether it's 4 or 5 hours or 30 minutes or maybe 10 minutes, the last person in line at 8 p.m. is going to be able to cast a ballot. And that means that the polling location cannot close. So we're only going to be as good as when every single voter is served at 8 p.m. and that's standing in line. Then what you will see in San Diego County, at least, is you'll see this lull from 8 o'clock to probably around 10:30, where we start seeing the polling place ballots coming into our operations from the 235 sites throughout the entire county. And then once it starts picking up, the momentum starts picking up where these polling locations are going to close and deliver to drop-off sites throughout the entire county, then we can start reporting out those results out. But you're correct, Evan, is that precincts reported no longer, at least in our state as well as in our county, really has the same emphasis as it had in the past. And the reason why is because in the past, when we were more neighborhood precinct centric in terms of knowing what the results were going to be occurring on election night, that's when it mattered the most, is because campaigns, the media were tracking these respective precincts to see whether or not we had finished our work. And that meant, by finishing up our work, that also meant that the decisiveness of the election was, for the most part, set. That's no longer the case, as what Professor Kousser has just mentioned, is that this now is not just, as I think I heard today, is these days, the new November is really October, because we're mailing everyone out a mail ballot. And that means if it's timely cast, postmarked by election day, and then received 17 days after election day for us in San Diego, as well as the state of California, that ballot is timely cast. And I anticipate there will be hundreds of thousands of mail ballots as well as provisional ballots that we have to consider that are timely cast in the 30-day window that we have to certify the election. That 30-day window, by the way, is precious time for us. And my counterparts in other part of the states don't even have anywhere close to that 30-day window. So I really feel for them, sympathize for them about really the short window of time, particularly in this world of a pandemic. Sorry for the long answer on that, but I wanted to make sure I covered all of it.
No, thank you very much. I mean, it's really informative, and I think it's key to talk about, get the sense of everything that's going into just here in San Diego, with this recognition that that's San Diego, and depending if you're in a different state or a different county, it's going to look very differently. Just speaking to this decentralized nature of our federal election system. So what I was wondering if Dr. Kousser, could you, I would follow up a little bit more about on election night then, right? So there's a host of litigation that's still pending in a lot of states about all sorts of these decisions about mail ballots and when they can begin processing or not, and where are drop ballot locations allowed or are they not. So if we're San Diego voters and we're watching election night, we see 8 p.m., we're going to see this kind of large chunk of votes come in that were these mail ballots that have already been processed. What are the states, as of now, I guess, that are both kind of like probably the swing states of the presidential that the media is going to be paying attention to anyway, and where we should not expect this giant chunk of mail ballots to be reported right away, but they are, we think, going to take several days to, so basically the mere opposite of California or San Diego, if you will.
Yeah, so I think that question, as you said, we'll need to know how some of the 275 pandemic-related election law cases that are now working their way through the courts are decided, if they're all decided. So two key states that everyone's going to be focusing on are Michigan and Pennsylvania. Both of these states are swing states that we always focus on, but what's new this year is that they've seen a big expansion in voting by mail. And so we're going to see both, whether the elections officials there are able to handle this increased demand and opportunities for voting by mail, but also how and when the results will be reported. So you see both in legislation and in the courts that some of the fights are over. Can you actually process these ballots before election day? So that doesn't mean counting votes, but it means processing to do the things like the signature check and everything else to determine that this is a legitimate ballot. Some elections officials really want to have that opportunity so they can go through and then start counting the ballots quickly. The second thing will be how many days will they be allowed to count those ballots? So some state leaders, mostly on the Republican side, who have been challenging the legitimacy of mail ballots, have been pushing for very short windows to count these ballots, saying you can't start processing until after election day, and then you need them all counted in 48 hours. So that will determine when we should see these ballots coming back, and B, sort of how thorough, how many opportunities voters will have to cure a potentially ballot that elections officials have questions about, and how the lawyers, who will probably be, just as we saw in Florida in 2000, they're watching the counting process, making sure, looking for the hanging chads with microscopes, but whatever the new version of that is, they'll be involved in that. How that controversy is worked out will determine whether we're waiting 2-3 days, a week or two, and how much the courts are involved in then challenging the legitimacy in the process of those ballot counts. So we're going to have to be patient to see how those political and judicial conflicts are resolved before the election, and then patient after the election, but keep your eye on Michigan and Pennsylvania.
Great. So that actually brings me to Lori. I wanted to ask, kind of from the grassroots level of voter education and outreach that you showed us, all these resources that the League of Women Voters have. Kind of like a two-pronged question. One would be how much coordination is there between San Diego and the other counties in California, or between California and the other states, that as far as the national level, like here's all these changes to be paying attention to. And then have you noticed from like a voter perspective, or even those that you might be working with to educate voters, just how much more challenging has it been to kind of keep track of these changes, whether they're COVID related changes or even pre-COVID, and with California kind of shifting into more and more mail balloting to begin with? You're up to the challenge, but the question is kind of like how difficult has that been, and have you sensed more voter confusion over how to go about this?
Yeah, those questions are actually very good and very closely related, because as Michael had said earlier, each jurisdiction operates its own election, and they run it the way that their municipality decides to do it. So, our organization, we have a state league that provides opportunities and resources for the local leagues in California to band together and produce and disseminate information. So, for example, that voters guide, the online voters guide called votersedge.org, that is that is a website that's curated by the League of Women Voters of California, and all the local leagues and everyone in California has access to it. And as I mentioned, it does provide you access to your customized ballot. And in addition, it provides you detailed information about each of the propositions and ballot measures that are local to you and statewide. So part of the answer to your question too regarding voter confusion, it not only derives from this particular year's strange voting season. I like to call it a season because, like Michael was saying, we've had to expand it. It's not election day anymore. We're looking at it in terms of a full month or 6 weeks worth of work. I know our organization has been working, as Michael's has, we've been working closely together to get out information about how to vote, where to vote, how it's different this year. So there is some confusion surrounding the new ways to vote per the pandemic. But this year in particular for California voters, if any of you had a chance to review any of the propositions, for example, some of them are extremely dense and very confusing. So your question about voter confusion, I think it applies across the board, not only to how to vote and where to vote, because as Michael says, now we have 235 super sites versus other traditional polling places that we had in the past. So we have to revisit that, the way we think about voting, the time that we give ourselves to vote, et cetera, and information around voting. So again, to your question, we have had to train ourselves to produce and provide the materials and information that we would normally have done in person with local organizations, going to their meetings and attending and providing answers to questions on site. We were doing that all virtually this year. So in the last election cycle, we hosted over 100 candidate forums and prop talks that were all done in person by our speakers bureau of 12 to 15 people. This year, of course, we're doing them mostly 99% or more virtually, which requires our attendees to have access to internet operations and facilities and technology that allows them to get that information. So it's going to be a little bit harder to get the information this year, perhaps for some people. Conversely, opportunities like this, Zoom, et cetera, have provided new ways for people to get information that perhaps they would not have gotten under other circumstances. So I think it's probably a two-edged sword, the situation that we've had to face and the opportunities and the challenges that we've had to overcome to provide this information in a way and in a format that voters need, that can help them actually understand what their job is this year, what their responsibilities are, the timing of that, how to participate in the actual process of voting, and of course, how to fill out their ballots, because filling out your ballot, of course, that's the essence of voting, right? You have to understand what you're voting on, and you have to have a good idea about how you want to shape your democracy. So that's been our challenge this election season.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing that will be interesting, and maybe I want to go to Michael with a specific question, but one thing that Lori said that if we have time, I'd like to go to Dr. Kousser with later, is this, thinking about silver linings with this and this dramatic increase in vote by mail. I mean, California was already on this trajectory for increasing vote by mail. We've seen that over the last several years in cycles. But because California is also one of the states that's more complicated with the number of ballot propositions, is this actually a benefit in the sense that you have it at home and it is easier to have your information, what ballot propositions, you've done your research, you can refer to it, you don't have to have it memorized or bring a cheat sheet into the ballot box with you at a traditional polling place. I wonder to what extent we'll see maybe more participation or greater satisfaction with the ballot proposition because of that. But Michael, I wanted to ask you, because the premise for this is fact versus fiction. And so one of the kind of pieces of rhetoric that we've heard is this notion of, well, there, despite what you said, oh no, actually there is mail ballots are different than absentee ballots. And with mail ballots, vote by mail, it's millions of ballots coming from everywhere. No one knows where they're coming from, and et cetera, et cetera. So while we know that that's not right, I wanted to give a specific example and then think about what is the process for this from an election administration side and from a voter side. So if you were a voter in California and let's say you recently moved into a new residence and you received voting or a ballot from the prior resident, they never changed or updated their information with the registrar's office. So you've received this ballot that has their name on it. Kind of a two-part question. What should that person do with that ballot, right? And then two, from an election administration side, what are the safeguards that go into preventing, even though, as Thad mentioned, it's 0.00036 that we even have these instances that we've caught, but the flip side of that is those are caught because we have these safeguards, is what she mentioned. So could you give us an example of like a safeguard that exists to prevent, a double mail ballot from coming in or the same person voting twice that way?
Thanks, Evan. So really quickly in the example that you just gave, if a person is going to receive a mail ballot from a prior resident that lived at that specific address, what they should be doing is writing return to sender and sending it back to our respective office. That's actually every single part of the maintenance of any type of voter registration file throughout the entire country. Most states, unless you're a same-day registration state, prior to what is known as the National Voter Registration Act passing, but by far the majority of all states run under and operate under the National Voter Registration Act, which is how you maintain the voter registration files. Our office is highly regulated when it comes down to how the voter registration file should be maintained from a federal level as well as a state level. And so when we send out any piece of mail, that election material, and when we get information back from the U.S. Postal Service that a piece of mail is undeliverable or through national change of address information, we're able to now update our voter registration file based off of that, and then turn around and send them what is known as a confirmation card directly to them so we can understand what their status is. Do they mean to, we've got some indication that they no longer live there. Is that true? Or do they have still the intent of living at that respective locations? And the laws are clear as a person does not lose their domicile simply the fact that they no longer respectively live there. We have people that live outside the country, expats that have the ability to vote. We have individuals that are military and overseas voters that have the ability to vote. We have college students that are going to school outside their respective county that has the ability to consider San Diego County as their place of registering to vote. Having said that, though, so that's what the voters should do. But I have to say, though, is what voters don't realize is that you cannot just throw millions of mail ballots out there without us knowing. And the reason why is because every single mail ballot that we issue is tracked. And we know who we've issued a mail ballot to. And a couple of safeguards I'm going to give you, not just one, but let me give you a couple of safeguards that are out there. First of all, we track every single one of those. Two, voters now have the ability to track their own respective mail ballot here in the state of California, as Professor Kousser has mentioned, through a notification system called Where's My Ballot? It's kind of like tracking your parcel through FedEx or UPS, you now have the ability to track your ballot as it's getting to you, as well as after you voted it, getting it back to our office and seeing it travel through the process when you do that. Every mail ballot is also signature verified. So when it gets back to our office, if there's any situation where a person is going to vote someone else's ballot, we don't just do a sampling of signature verification. I think there's a myth out there that somehow we just pick maybe a couple of percentages of the mail ballots and check it just to make sure that it's the one and the same person. No, every single one of the mail ballots that come back to our office is checked against the signature on file. And we have to escalate it too. It's not just one person, but it's multiple people that are looking at a person's signature before we validate it, or we discount it and now challenge it and have to notify the voter for their ability to cure it, at least here in the state of California and here in San Diego County. Let me just say one other thing for those that are listening in, whether it's in San Diego or whether it's outside of San Diego and maybe in other parts of the country. There has been decades worth of experience in mail balloting here, not just this one upcoming election. And the national discussion is, I think, clouding perhaps the psyche of potentially San Diegans out there. What's happening out there in the world of the conversation on a national level is now seeping into whether or not one should question about mail balloting. And the simple answer is, if there's any questions associated with the security levels, the chain of custody protocols that we have here, you can go to our website at sdvote.com, but you can simply come to our office. It is a very transparent office that a person has the ability to see how mail ballots are processed all the way through until it gets scanned into our tabulation system. So those are just a couple of safeguards that we have there, but I think there are a couple of linchpins in this whole process. One that you mentioned is the registration rolls. And I can go through the litany of ways we maintain our voter registration rolls. And then two is the fact that we signature verify every single mail ballot that is out there. And then, as I mentioned before, now voters can take it within their hands to protect themselves by those good practices: signing, sealing, signing the ballot envelope, sealing the ballot inside the envelope, and then returning it to a trusted source. And for us, the trusted sources are the U.S. Postal Service, any of our mail ballot drop-off locations, or any of our polling locations that we have out there. So those are, and then you can track it as well. So those are the ways that a voter could have, if you will, good voting hygiene.
Yeah, thank you. You mentioned signature verification as one of the safeguards, and I have one more question that I wanted to ask Thad, and then we have some questions from the audience that we'll get to. But speaking of signature verification, so in your opening remarks, Dr. Kousser, you mentioned this kind of newfound disproportionate partisanship when it comes to preference for voting method. And one of the concerns that we would have is the extent to which we have a lack of faith in the legitimacy of the results. And so one of the things that can stem from is when you believe the votes were not counted as they were intended, right? Or people were voting who shouldn't have been voting, or people who should be voting, their vote wasn't counted. And so, and we've seen a partisan divide on belief in either of those recently as well. So on the subject of specifically, I guess, signature verification, what should we know from political science about ballot rejection rates and whether or not mail ballots are rejected because signatures, if they don't match, which is part of the safeguards, and we know that different states have different protocols as far as notify the voter that so they can come remedy that situation, and some states have different versions of that. But do we have disproportionality on certain voters more likely to have their signature or their ballot rejected?
Yes, that's a good question. And there have been studies in not in every state, but in the states where we have information, demographic information about voters because of the Voting Rights Act. And so unfortunately, what some of those studies have found, and again, we don't know if this is true nationally, but that there are fairly high rejection rates, and that those are disproportionately so younger voters and members of racial and ethnic minorities more likely to have their ballots rejected. And so that is one of the reasons why many people have urged lots of folks to try to vote at polling places, because the thought is that you'll have a lower chance of having your ballot rejected. All of this research is important because the antidotes to distrusting elections come from understanding all of the huge safeguards that are in place that Registrar Vu had. And so again, I would echo his encouragement of people to find out about those safeguards, to learn about them, to go down and watch them. So we're doing a collaboration with a nonprofit group to send voters out information saying, here are some of the safeguards, sharing information from the Secretary of State's office, and also giving them information about the Where Is My Ballot app, to see if that actually increases turnout and increases faith in the elections. So that's one way. Learning about the many safeguards in the process is one way to decipher fact from fiction. But the other thing that I think it's important to do is to understand that this partisan divide that has opened up in how people want to vote, because that could help us interpret the results. So if we see different votes, different percentage votes for the two presidential candidates between election day voters and mail ballot voters, that is completely explainable by the fact that, because we've seen this different discourse by our leaders, especially our president, pushing Republicans more towards voting on election day, Democrats more towards voting by mail, that means that we should, even knowing that both of these processes are accurately and legitimately counting voters correctly, that will give us different outcomes through those two different methods of voting. And understanding that difference in preference can explain the difference in outcomes and can give people faith that there's nothing untoward going on in the counting of either election day or mail ballot voters. So that's part of why we're doing that research. And then I just want to go back really quickly to the point that you raised earlier, which is this: there's very much the hope that with these incredibly demanding set of choices on these really complicated ballot measures, some of which, as I was sitting down with my ballot, I started to think, oh my gosh, what is going on with with this proposition? There's a hope that voting by mail will give more people the opportunity to have that Voter's Edge website in front of them, or that Secretary of State's ballot guide out in front of them, and do that research. Unfortunately, from the one study that I've conducted on this with Megan Mullen at Duke, what we found, and we looked at voters voting either by mail or at polling places who were similar in the same types of elections. This was just determined by, there's some areas where people just have to vote by mail and have always had that in California. So we looked at sort of holding all else equal. People who voted by mail were actually more likely to drop off the ballot and not cast a vote on the propositions. And the idea here is, well, what explains this? Maybe just when you actually go to the ballot, to a polling place, and have taken the time to wait in line and sign in, you're going to vote that whole ballot. You've got a little bit of time to do that. Whereas when you're at home, you have so many other things. There's the laundry, there's the dog, there's all these things competing for your attention, and that may draw people away from their ballots. So that's just one study, but unfortunately we don't have evidence that people voting at home are kind of super voters who have the time to study the ballot in greater depth.
Okay, great, thank you. So I want to get to, we have several questions coming in. And so I'm going to just kind of ask these to the broad group, but it might be clear who among you should probably take it first. But maybe we can try to get through these with, because some of these are pretty specific questions. But I'm just going to follow the thread on signature verification, just to follow up real quick with Michael. So in San Diego, if a signature is found to not match, what happens next for that ballot and for that voter?
Well, let me say this much: is I know that we're parsing words here, but really it's not so much as a match. I think there's a notion that the signatures have to be identical match, and really what it comes down to, based off of California law, is that they have to compare. And the reason why is because in state law, the policies of state law of California is that we have to liberally construe in the favor of the voter. So of course, a voter is not going to remember how they signed a voter registration form or how they signed their name on the DMV unless on their driver's license, unless they looked at their driver's license, of which that's one of the things that we're trying to educate voters on doing when they vote their mail ballot is to look at their driver's license if there's any questions about it. But for us, we're looking at many other factors associated with the signature because we know that signatures are going to change over time and that individuals also may want to change their respective signatures. For us, we're looking at unique characteristics of the signature, and we have training around that with individuals like the FBI who have trained us on techniques to look at the various characteristics of a signature, the slants, the uniqueness of an I, the way they cross their T's, the way they loop their respective signatures, because not everyone's going to sign it the same way. We have situations where on the registration form, they signed their full name, but when they filled out their envelope, they provided their first letter of their first name as well, their initials effectively. Well, if we are able to validate it based off of those features and compare it, we are going to count that respective ballot. But let's say we have escalated through 5 different people within our office based off of all the documentations that we have of a voter and their profile, and we've exhausted all of our efforts and we still can't count this respective mail ballot because it does not compare. We are now legally required to notify that voter that they have the ability to cure their signatures so long as it's done 2 days before I certify the election. So as I mentioned, there's a 30-day window for me to be able to certify an election. And generally for me, I take all 30 days regardless, because I want to make sure at the end of the day, when I sign on the dotted line that this is the certified results, that it's an accurate results that I am certifying to. So I will take all the time necessary to certify that election results. And as we talked about earlier, is candidates that are a toss-up election is counting on us to certify the most accurate results. Let me just be selfish about it too, is I take all 30 days is because for me, is I want to make sure that I will withstand a recount as well. So when a candidate comes to me and thinks that they're going to do a recount, that's perfectly fine that they could request a recount, but know that we've gone through every single one of these ballots, all of the mail ballots, all the provisional ballots that we're not going to count to make sure that it will withstand a recount before that is requested. But let me get back to this notion of not just the miscompare, but also there are situations where a voter does not sign the back of their mail ballot envelope. In those respective cases as well, those individuals we have to notify them and they have the ability to cure their mail ballot as so long as it's 2 days before an election official certifies the results of the election in the state of California. Not necessarily the case in other parts of the state. I'm only speaking of that of California. And by signing an affidavit and getting that affidavit back to us by email, by taking a phone, picture and sending it to us by fax or by hand delivering it to our office or by mail too.
Okay, great. And I imagine is the missing signature is the more common occurrence than something that doesn't compare.
It's a combination, but let me get back to this. The heart of the rejection rate, by the way, of mail ballots, and I was looking at our percentages in the last election. Our percentage of counting mail ballots is 99.1%. So, or actually even less than, it's even more than that. It's like 99.4%. And when we looked at our results in comparison to the other jurisdictions in the state, it's really low in terms of our rejection rate. But the number one reason why a mail ballot is rejected is because of time. It's either it's not postmarked on time or it's received after the deadline. And in this case, the legislature and the governor has stepped in and added a 14-day window. We call it postmark +3. Now it's postmark +17 going into November's election. So long as the ballot is postmarked by election day and received 17 days after election day, we can count that ballot. In March's election, it was postmarked by election day and received 3 days after election day. But for any voter out there, our recommendation is always to return that ballot early and get it through the mail system or drop it off to any one of the mail ballot drop-off locations that are out there, particularly in a world of a pandemic.
Great. So one question that is definitely specific to California, but might have implications for maybe the West Coast right now in general, is to what extent are the potential for fires and wildfires? Are there plan Bs? Are there auxiliary kind of, this is what we do if we get near that, now I guess in San Diego, that 4-day window, or other parts of the state? Is that something that the state elections office communicates with, or is it something that you guys just figure out on your own?
Evan, there are laws on the books about how to address natural disasters, including wildfires, about what that may look like. And certainly when it comes down to the administrative side to it, we're having to look at all the different, we're like crisis managers, really what it comes down to. Not only are we wedding planners, mass wedding planners, because we only have 1 day to make sure that everything is going off without a hitch. Really now it's 3 days, 3 more days. But we're having to be crisis managers because we have to think about all the things that could go wrong. We have to think about, in one elections that I've conducted, we had to call in vector control because there was a beehive that voters couldn't get inside the polling location because there was a beehive. So we had to call vector control to remove it. In this specific case, wildfires. Yes, we have to be concerned about wildfires. And so we are very close with SDG&E. SDG&E, that's San Diego Gas and Electric, has the list of all of our polling locations that we will have, all of our mail ballot drop-off locations that we have, so that they can communicate to us if there is a specific area within the county that they may close out turn off the power lines and potentially as a result of wildfires, so we can then have a sufficient time to react and maybe relocate that polling locations to somewhere else, or to bring even generators in should they close the power lines that operates at respective locations. So I would just not localize it to wildfires, even though that is one of the respective areas. And my counterparts up north are having to manage this right now. There's wildfires happening in Northern California to the millions of acres that are out there. And they're having to manage how they will ultimately facilitate the elections. But in our respective case, we work closely with the Secretary of State's office. We work closely with groups like the Red Cross. I know that those are dialogues that I just had even today about how displaced voters are going to be able to vote, and how they are decentralizing where these displaced voters are going to be, and how we can assist those individuals to be able to get a ballot, and particularly a ballot with their respective contests in this upcoming election. So there's a lot of logistics behind it and a lot of coordination to kind of map this all out and then be able to have enough reactive time to address the situation as it comes. And there is, again, as I mentioned before, a litany of laws that really came in place as a result of Hurricane Sandy in New York. A lot of laws came in as a result of that, of how we would not just assist voters, but also how we would assist disaster workers as well for their ability to cast a ballot.
So one question here, I think I can answer, but I'll ask it in case anyone wants to correct me. So one of the questions was, what happens if a voter votes for all the propositions but leaves all the candidate races blank? The ballot counts, right? And you all voted for all that. And from my understanding, that doesn't happen very often. In most cases, it might be the other way around, where the candidates are more frequently top of the ticket, right? And then there's roll off. But if that's your prerogative, right? It's a perfectly valid ballot.
Evan, can I just speak to that just quickly? In our research, one of the things we found to be one of the causes that people don't vote is because of intimidation. They just feel intimidated. They feel unprepared and not up to the task. So to your point there, or to the questioner's point, we don't tell people that they must complete every item on the ballot, because, our goal is to get people to vote to the best of their ability. We want informed voters, but as we were mentioning earlier, some of these propositions are just very complex and perhaps not really relevant to a particular voter. Perhaps they don't have an opinion on, particular proposition. So we want to encourage those voters to just vote anyway. If you need to leave some areas blank, you don't feel like you want to inform yourself, or it's not relevant to you, then just skip a question or a candidate. But vote anyway. Vote to the best of your ability and just leave blank whatever you must.
Yeah, and I know, just anecdotally, well, I guess anecdotally and from some research that there are places, particularly in the South in non-presidential years, where the local sheriff race is the leading vote getter, more so than Senate or governor or House. And so those are voters who are definitely, that's what they care. That's what's salient to them, and they're deliberately leaving off and not casting votes for the top of the ticket. And that's, you know, that's their prerogative. So I have two more questions, and I think I know the order I want to go in here. So one is, are there legislative changes or legislative, I guess, efforts in the works in California to increase funding for election operations in anticipation of population shifts and changes and potentially greater voter participation? Is that something that the state legislature, is that just kind of perpetually on their agenda and it's a question of how much funding, or is there something in the works to increase funding for local election offices?
Let me go ahead and take that. Not that I've heard. I know that there's always a want and need to request funds, whether that's federal, from the federal government or from the state level. You know, this pandemic, sorry, my light keeps on turning off because it's on an automatic if I'm not moving. So I generally have a flag, my flag to turn it back on when I'm doing these presentations. So I have not heard anything from the state legislative side of any additional funding, but let me just say that approximately over $100 million was allocated for this upcoming elections. Some of it was federal, some of it was state. Approximately $35 million was from the federal government as a result of the CARE Act that the Secretary of State or the state received, and the remaining was allocated. I'm sorry, I've got that reversed. It was like $67 million through the CARES Act, and then the other $35 million was from the state, and the $35 million was specifically earmarked for voter education and outreach efforts. And the other $67 million was related to all of the necessary needs related to COVID-19. I haven't heard any more. I always know that it is a perpetual debate that elections official needs more money. Let me just say, democracy is expensive. This will be the most costly elections for San Diego County of all the things that we are purchasing, all the personal protective equipment that we're having to purchase, all the shifting that we're having to do, the various programs that we're having to implement in this election. If you looked at our budget, you could see from one year to this year, it's like a 45% increase. And we might not see the end of that because we don't know how much ultimately this election is going to cost. After the 2000 presidential general election, as many individuals may know, is Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, which allocated $3.9 billion. And really, there wasn't any additional funding since that time frame until most recently after the 2016 election to safeguard, because of cybersecurity, did they add more additional funds to it. CARES Act added more funds to it, but it seems like it's not an ongoing funding source. And I think that's something that is needs to be really discussed at the state level as well as the federal level about how to run elections in the United States to make sure that elections officials have the resources that they need to be able to appropriately create the infrastructure for their respective jurisdictions. Let me just say, here in San Diego County, we've been fortunate that we've had a very supportive board of supervisors as well as CAO, and we really haven't been lacking in terms of resources. We've been able to create the infrastructure where really, for me in this operation here, we're really not concerned about the sending everyone a mail ballot because we have the capacity. We've built the infrastructure and the processes and the safeguards in place over decades as opposed to just one election. And we have the necessary equipment to be able to process them efficiently, but also accurately that's out there. But yeah, I know that my counterparts in other parts of the country struggle with this issue because they are not getting the necessary funding. And in certain cases, they're considered the kind of the redheaded stepchild of a county organization or a jurisdiction, or maybe even the state, simply because of them, of policymakers thinking that we're just a 2-year cycle, or really every election every 4 years. But that's not really the case. Every election is important, and we need to be able to get the necessary supplies and equipment in advance of go live date, which is election day generally.
Yeah, and Thad, did you want to follow up on that briefly?
Yes, so first, I absolutely agree with Registrar Vu that it's hugely important to invest in the mechanisms of democracy. I mean, you can't be a great wedding planner without a good budget. And but I also wanted to highlight that state lawmakers have really been exceptionally active in changing the rules of California elections and introducing new policies that are aimed at both increasing turnout. So remember, in 2014, we had the lowest turnout percentage in any election in state history. And so they were concerned about both increasing turnout, but also broadening that turnout, ensuring that these participation gaps that have been so persistent in California and American politics, across age lines, across racial and ethnic lines, right, across educational lines, trying to put in place policies that will close those gaps. And so if you want to learn more about those policies and their effects, this UC project that I'm part of, the New Electorate Project, has a whole website, newelectorateproject.org, newelectorateproject.org, where you can see studies of these effects, and we'll be releasing some new studies at an event through the UC Center Sacramento on October 22nd that'll include the two chairs of the Senate and Assembly Elections Committees.
So thank you. We have a few minutes. I want to kind of say what my final question is going to be for each of you, and give you time to think about it for a second, and then ask one more very specific, hopefully just like a brief question, clarifying question. So the final question is, going into Election Day, what are you kind of simultaneously most worries you? But then to put a positive spin on it, what's one thing, if someone could walk away from this kind of deputized with information, one piece of information that they could help disseminate to, what would you want that to be? And those might go hand in hand, those two ideas. So as we're thinking about that, though, just a very specific question, probably for Michael, is what happens? Who's allowed in the polling places? There's been discussion about go watch the polls, go check on them to make sure there's nothing funny going on. But there's not a lot of clarity as to what that would even mean, and I think there's some confusion out there in the rhetoric about what that is and if that's allowed, and if you could just kind of speak to that very quickly about who's allowed in and who's not, and that kind of thing.
Thanks, Evan. So who's allowed? Well, again, it's the right of the public to see their election process unfold. That means that anyone is allowed inside a polling place. But they're not allowed inside the voting area where individuals are retiring and casting their respective votes, but they have the ability to go inside and observe the process to make sure that everything is secure and up to snuff, if you will, to make sure that they can account for this. So there is the right of an observer. There is the right of a poll watcher, but let me just say that there's the operative term here, is that they have the ability to observe and they have the right to watch. They have other rights as well, as like looking at the street index. They have the right to look at who's voted, who hasn't voted. They have the right to look at the roster of voters as well. But what they don't have the right to do, where it really is the voter's right, is a voter's right is to be free from any level of intimidation, free from any level of interference of the election process, and free from any level of rhetoric that would occur inside that polling location. And so an individual that wants to come in to observe, they have that right. And they have that right to view. They can take notes. They don't have the right to have a camera and start taking pictures of voters that are out there. And that's what they ultimately can do. And anyone can go inside and observe that process. Of course, when they do so, they cannot have any election material, what we call campaigning or electioneering on themselves, like a hat that says for or against a measure or for or against a specific candidate. That cannot be allowed inside their respective locations. And let me just also hit upon the other aspects of this, is now we're having to balance that with the pandemic itself and understand that a person has a constitutional right, if they do not want to wear a mask, to still be in that respective location to observe. But because of the balancing act, we've been working with our public health officials that if they're going to do so, they have to remain at least there will be clear demarcations inside our polling locations as to where they can observe and to ensure that there's a 6 feet worth of social distancing. But a person that has a mask can stay in there in a specific interval of time, depending on how many observers that there will be at any given time. And if there's too many, then we will create a rotation system associated with it. And if it's an observer that is not going to wear a mask, then they can only be inside to observe at 10 minutes at a specific time based off of our public health officials.
Okay, great. So we're technically 1 minute over, but I just want to give everyone one kind of final opportunity to just what you're worried about, but then what our audience should kind of carry forward with them, one piece of information. So I'll go in the same order that we kind of led off with. So we'll have Lori, Michael, and Thad. Lori.
Thanks, Evan. I try not to worry. I mean, there's so much out there right now to worry about. I just try to think about the work that needs to be done and just get that work done. So my big interest right now is to ensure that every citizen in San Diego has the wherewithal, the ability, the opportunity, and the knowledge to be an informed and active voter. And so I work every single day to get information out. I work with the Registrar of Voters office to coordinate messaging with them, safety information, debunking, pre-bunking. We focus on getting rid of fake news. I mean, we are very, very diligent every single day to get messages to voters to help them be informed and active participants in our society and democracy.
Okay, thanks. Michael?
I would say there's a level of insanity that's going on with this upcoming election, at least in San Diego County. As I mentioned before, is that something that generally takes 4 to 6 years to pivot in terms of changing the model of an election. We're doing in a very short 4 to 6 month, if that, in terms of the overall time frame. For me, I think if there was going to be a concern, it really comes down to one thing, which is across all elections, all major elections, and that is what are voters thinking? What is ultimately going to be voters' behavior, particularly in this now world of the pandemic? You kind of generally can understand the cadence of voters, of how they're going to behave during an election cycle. This one is all over the map because we are having to inform, as Lori mentioned, we've gone boots on the ground as much as we can on doing as many presentations virtually, all of our digital digital ads, social media pushes, just to inform the voter. Whether the question for me is it resonating? Are individuals seeing it? Are they becoming informed? Are they becoming aware of the changes that are happening in this upcoming election? And for me, there's points in time. This past Monday was a big indicator for me because we were a little bit concerned of what we saw in Fairfax, Virginia on day one of their early voting, where there was long lines going outside their respective building. Was that going to happen here at the Registrar of Voters office? Will it occur here at the Registrar of Voters or at any of the 235 locations? For me, I don't want to be a statistic on at least our public health officials' radar. What's going to happen 4 days from election day? Will we see a spike of the pandemic? Are people going to be able to vote safely? And for me, is to create that environment to knowing that we've done everything in our power to allow people to cast their ballots and do it in a safe way. And voters can help themselves in that regard. And we would ask for voter cooperation. That's what we're asking here. The question is, will that occur? And that's a big unknown at this point in time for us.
Great. And Dr. Kousser will give you the last word.
Great. I worry about either candidate declaring victory before votes have been counted. Anyone trying to press pause on the important democratic machinery while they're ahead and effectively disfranchising everyone else. So I think the solution to that is recognizing that this will be an election unlike any other, that we have thousands of incredibly diligent and apolitical elections officials all across the country doing their best to count votes, cast in legitimate ways, and we need to trust that process and be patient with it.
Well, thank you so much to Lori, Michael, and Thad. I think this was really informative for all of us, and also want to thank Carl Luna who organized this event and brought everyone together. And so everyone out there, go forth and spread the good word of what is fact versus fiction, and we'll see each other on the other side of all of this. All right, thanks a lot. Bye, guys.
Thank you.